Rise now, ye tarnished. For the first Soulsborne episode of Story Bakes with Katie Sue. Today I'm making basil cream puffs with raspberry jam and cotton candy, inspired by a consumable item in Elden Ring. I don't play a ton of video games, but when I do. Actually, when I do, it's usually like Stardew Valley or Hades or Witcher 3, but when I watch video games being played, it's usually something Soulsborne. Let's turn on the PS5 for inspiration. I only started playing Elden Ring myself recently. I got a few bonfires into Stormvale Castle and got scared, so I'm hanging out in Limgrave for now. You know, just petting some dogs. There are a couple of rune bears out here though, so there aren't a lot of places where you're safe. If you have the aptly named cookbook for the Preserving Boluses, you'll see that these cream puff looking doodads are made out of dew-kissed herba, crystal cave moss, and a sacramental bud. Well, if you ask me, dew-kissed herba looks quite a bit like basil. Hold on. Dew-kissed, which will go into the pastry cream part of the cream puffs. The crystal cave moss will be represented by a sprinkling of blue sugar, and the sacramental bud is, of course, filled with fresh blood, but instead I'm making a bit of jam from frozen raspberries. Preserving boluses alleviate scarlet rot buildup, which is as gross as it sounds, and I haven't even made it to the lake of rot yet. I'm using white Craquelin and pink cotton candy to get that cracked, fuzzy look that just screams, I should eat that. While we're here, the greases will definitely become cakes at some point. Now, let's leave the lands between and get to the baking. First, take your basil and chop it up. This was a few sprigs, maybe about 1 cup chopped. Then in a saucepan, combine 2 cups of whole milk, 115 grams of sugar, and the basil. Take it to the stove and bring it to a simmer. Turn off the heat, put the lid on, and let the basil steep for about 15 to 20 minutes. Strain the basil out in the manner that seems best to you. Then in a separate bowl containing 4 egg yolks, add 32 grams of cornstarch and a pinch of salt. Whisk until it's fully combined, then slowly add the hot milk mixture to the eggs, whisking constantly. This is so that we run less risk of curdling the eggs. Head back to the stove and heat, whisking constantly until nice big bubbles pop. Strain the pastry cream, then add 2 teaspoons of vanilla and 2 tablespoons of butter and stir them in until the butter is melted and it's all smooth. If it wasn't the hottest part of summer, I would cover this and set it aside to cool to room temperature before putting it in the fridge, but seeing as how room temperature is in the mid-90s, I'm going to set up an ice bath and stir the pastry cream over it until it cools. Cover the pastry cream so that your parchment paper or plastic wrap is in contact with the surface of the cream, and put it in the fridge for at least a couple of hours. Sneak in a little Katie snack before we make some jam. In a small saucepan, combine 100 grams of frozen raspberries, 75 grams of sugar, and 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. Bring it to a boil and cook it until it reaches 220 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if you're not into the often punishing play style of From Software games, check out some of the videos on the lore of any of them. The worlds of these games are deep and interesting and quite often tragic. Nobody has it good in a Soulsborne game. A lot of the storytelling comes from item descriptions, so it can be difficult to put everything together. Creators like Vatividia do an awesome job at stitching together the histories of these worlds, so go check them out if that kind of thing interests you. There's a link to their channel in the description below. If you like seeds in your jam, feel free to skip this next part, but I don't like that, so I'm straining them out. Cover and refrigerate the jam until we're ready to assemble the puffs. For the Craquelin, mix 57 grams of softened butter with 65 grams of sugar with a whisk. Then add some white food coloring and mix it in. Add 65 grams of all-purpose flour and stir it in to make a dough. Turn the dough out onto some parchment paper, and I'm using 3mm sticks to roll it out evenly. Because I misjudged how big my parchment paper should be, I trim off the excess that's squishing out and fill in the gaps with it. So what is the scarlet rot that these boluses will cure you of? There's a lot going on with it, and I'll put a link to a lore video, one of many, in the corner. But in short, it's an ailment that will kill you, unless you're a demigod, in which case you'll just go crazy, maybe. And it's also a goddess. So, yeah, there's a lot to go over, and I'm really just here to bake things. So once the Craquelin dough is all at an even thickness, I transfer it to a baking sheet and put it in the freezer while we make the pâte. First, whisk together 90 grams of bread flour with a quarter teaspoon of salt, then set it aside. In a saucepan, combine 60 grams of water, 60 grams of whole milk, and 60 grams of butter, and bring it to a boil. I was recently told that I should stop forgetting to film things, and you're not wrong. So add the flour in all at once and continue to cook the dough, stirring constantly. What you're looking for is for a thin layer of dough to be cooked to the bottom of the pan, like so. I think I actually cooked mine a bit too long, trying to get an even layer all over the bottom of the pan, but that just means that I'm going to add more eggs than I thought I would need in this next part. Transfer the dough to a bowl and let it cool a little bit. While it cools, I'm going to prepare my baking sheet by using a 2-inch cookie cutter and some flour to mark my baking mat. Now the dough is still warm here, just not hot enough to cook the eggs. And I'm going to slowly add 2 beaten eggs to it, fully mixing in each addition before adding the next. After adding both eggs, the dough is nowhere near where I need it to be, so I'm adding about another egg and a half so that I have a dough that falls off the spatula in this nice V shape. This might have been a bit too runny, but it mostly works out. I'm using a Wilton 2-way tip in my piping bag, then piping those 2-inch circles I marked out earlier. This actually made more dough than I thought, so I eyeballed a few more. Now I'm using that same 2-inch cookie cutter to cut out rounds of my chilled craquelin that I will then place on top of the pâte choux like little hats. See how the choux pastry has spread out? I got the dough a little too thin. But we carry on and put the craquelin scraps onto a baking sheet for snacking purposes. Bake the choux at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 to 40 minutes, and when you take them out, bake the craquelin scraps for about 8 to 10 minutes. Immediately poke a hole in the bottom of the puffs with a sharp knife to let any steam trapped inside escape to the outside. Some of the bottoms were so thin and crunchy that they just kind of broke. I'm not sure if this is because the pâte choux was a little runny. It was a good thing I had extra puffs to work with. Alright, let's put it all together. I'm preparing a piping bag with an Ateco number 12 tip, then getting my pastry cream out of the fridge. If you're like me, the first time you make pastry cream and take it out of the fridge, you may be alarmed that your nice smooth cream has become a gelatinous mass. But never fear. That is totally normal, and it just takes a bit of stirring to loosen it back up. This goes into the piping bag, and then fill up those cream puffs. I wasn't sure quite how big the puffs were going to get, and I only ended up with enough cream for 6 of the choux, so double the pastry cream recipe would fill all of the cream puffs. I'm using a Wilton number 230 tip for the raspberry jam, and, just squeeze some in there. Clean up those bottoms, then flip them over and dust with some powdered sugar. If I had taken the pastry out a little bit earlier before the craquelin browned, I would skip this step. But this will make the puffs more white, like the boluses are underneath the fuzz. And now for the fuzz, which is just some pink cotton candy that I had to go to 3 different stores to find. My original thought was to place it on the puffs and use this scribe tool to poke it into the pastry, but this just poked holes in the cotton candy, and you can just gently lay fluffy bits of the cotton candy on the puffs, and as long as you don't move too enthusiastically, they'll stay on well enough. Let's take a look at our Preserving Boluses cream puffs with white craquelin, basil pastry cream, raspberry jam, and cotton candy. And let's sprinkle on a bit of the blue sugar for the crystal cave moss. Not bad. The fuzz on the boluses is a darker pink, but I was kinda limited on cotton candy choices. I'd eat that to save me from the rot. I actually don't care for cotton candy, so I'm just going to take that off, and here we go for the cross section. My choux pastry wasn't perfect, but there is still plenty of pastry cream in these bad boys, and now it's time for a taste. I really like these. The basil flavor is pronounced but not overpowering, and pairs really nicely with the raspberry jam. There's a nice crunch from the craquelin, and the pastry cream is smooth. They're pretty big cream puffs, so I'd maybe make smaller ones next time. But who are we kidding? I'm going to finish this. There was not very much in the way of leftovers to make for Katie snacks this time. I do have that extra craquelin that bakes up into crispy cookie-like snacks, and even without the filling, I'll snack on the choux pastry. Hit the like button if you want to see more Soulsborne bakes, subscribe and hit the notification bell if you're so inclined, and let me know in the comments what characters, shows, or movies I should turn into bakes next. Thanks for watching!